Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Margaux, the manager of customer experience at 55 Degrees. And with me today, I have the lovely Caroline. She's an Atlassian Consultant at Sentify. And today we're going to talk to you about story points and how to maybe avoid story points and instead use flow metrics into improving your agile practices. So let's get started. So what are story points? Because what do you think, Caroline? What would be the best way to define a story point?
A relative estimate of what you feel is the complexity and possible duration of the work that you're going to take on at that moment.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. The thing is that there's not a true one and only definition of what a story point is. So that's why I put on this slide. You can read 3 different definitions that are roughly the same, but there's always some type of nuances between people when you ask about story points. But if I ask you story point, what value would you give? Like what type of unit of value do you think about?
A number. We use the Fibonacci scale in my practice.
So that's what I thought too. I thought that's what it would be, but or t-shirt sizes. But recently, while doing some research for this presentation, I realized that story points come in any shape, color, and whatever you want. And here's different scales I found out there. And I found that quite interesting because it goes from, motor, transportation mode, t-shirt size. Those I've heard from before. But I've never heard about building, dogs, fruits, and animals.
I had no idea there were this many either, but I'm sure people are having fun with them.
Exactly. So I would be curious, like if anybody who's viewing this webinar, what do you use? And if you use any of those, and how would you explain those different steps? So feel free to just drop that in the chat or just let us know after the event, because I'm really curious, because I thought it was interesting that even with the scale of transportation mode, they don't always agree on what's what. So I'm just wondering, how do people know what a 1 represent in one place and what's in another place? Because how would you define that, Caroline, in your mind? Like, because you said it's about effort, complexity, but how
Yeah,
would you?
effort, complexity, risk, and but what's complex for me might not be complex for you. So it's my story point based on what I think, and then the team can come to a consensus. But again, people are going to have a different interpretation of, the airplane versus the yacht scaling, just like they would, is it a 13? Is it a 20? Is it more? And then on the other end of things, I've seen them break down, and you have an example later of breaking down story points into such minute pieces. It's like, I don't know how you tell the difference between a half a point skateboard or a 1 point bicycle. And then if you take that down to a quarter of a point versus a 3/4 of a point, like what is the difference in that effort? It's way too small of a measurement for me.
No, exactly. And I think we lose, like this, is just what's the true definition and what is it? Because it becomes really difficult then to know exactly, like you said, like, okay, but what does that mean? And what does a 0.5 mean? And I quite like that on those scales, there's even zeros. So you give value of something that has complexity of 0. So does that mean that there's no work involved? It just, I find
Yeah.
that a little bit difficult to process, because to me it should start at 1. Something easy should be a 1, and then it escalates with complexity. But 0, I thought that was quite an interesting one. And going off your point, I wanted to show what we just discussed, really. Why estimates can be misleading, actually, because like you said, complexity and effort, what would be difficult for you might not be for me, and vice versa. And I always like the example of, if you ask me to change the tire on your car, good luck, and we'll be there again next week, because I've never done it. So I would not know how to do it. So of course it's going to take me a lot longer than if I ask my uncle, who's a car mechanic, who would just do that, with the eyes closed. So I think that's something that's worth noting, that it's really the complexity and effort can really change from one person to the next. But are we still supposed to, as a team, rate the work in the same way then? Because then it really depends on who's estimating, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I find that this is a really good representation when you look at complexity, priorities changing, and not having all the information. That's one of the key benefits of Agile is you can work on something without knowing everything at the end result. You can work on it iteratively and learn it as you go. But inherently, there's a challenge there with if on day one, when I'm in refinement and my team is looking at assigning points to everything, they may do a really good job of discussing it, understanding it. The complexity is it, in development intensive, QA intensive. They can come to an agreement on that work at that moment. But in the real world in business, priorities change all the time. So everything you estimated today might be wrong tomorrow because something's going to come in and knock it all upside down. And then not having all the information, you might pull in something that you talked about on a high level and you think you know what you need to know to say, yeah, this is a 5 and we think it'll be done, within this sprint. But then other things come up and you're like, oh, this is harder than we thought. We need to break this down into more stories, or we simply need to spend more time on it. So you can do your best at do relative sizing, comparing it to previous work, assigning story points to it. But if you look at the reality of that, is that valuable a week later? Is it valuable if I'm doing the work and then I'm homesick or something and somebody else has to pick up?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to be able to fill in? Is it going to be the same effort for them as it was for me? So much changes after you sign that story point.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think where a lot of the misleading part comes in.
And how often do people go back and edit the story point value that they had given 2 weeks ago because now they have more information? I've never heard that. So maybe some teams are really good and they do that, but then the plan's already made, right? So do they adjust the plan based on this? Maybe some do, but I don't think that's the majority of people, sadly.
Right. We were actually advised not to in my training when I was learning. You sign a story point and you stick with it, even if you didn't finish the work and it's got to go on to the next sprint. So it is definitely challenging. So
then even when you wouldn't change the plan and then the higher chance is going to fail, right?
Right. Yep. And that's disheartening for the team when they can't get stuff done in the time frame that they thought they could.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's not very motivating when you're going to fail and then there's consequences behind it. So that makes sense. But I can give an example of something that happened here at 55 degrees. So we did a major update recently. So we released the stuff. Oh, it's great. We did a lot of testing. It's great. And then there's a small thing from the code that got removed and then things broke. The data loader to load an external file didn't work the way we thought it would, and things changed. So our priorities changed, right? We had to fix all of those stuff. And one small thing turned into something much bigger. And then it's just, we don't do story points, but that still had an impact in how we did our work. So if we had planned everything with story points, our plan would have exploded just based on this. So I think that happens more often than we think. So yeah, story points are not always value that will prove that you're safe, you're good, everything is rock solid, right?
But even the easy ones, like when you feel a little bit safer when you're sizing something out like a 1, 2, or a 3, because that's likely that you'd be able to get that done in a relatively short period of time. But I can tell you that, and I know you'll show this later, that you start off with a 1 or 2 and you think, oh yeah, I can knock that out. And then somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, oh, by the way, we have a problem. And this is no longer the priority. You got to jump over to this thing. So by the time you get back to those stories that were 1, 2s, or 3s, it might be 5 days later when you thought you'd be done with all that work. So
so the easy task took way longer than the one that was going to be more complicated. So I have some real data to show you of that, just like you said. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. And just a bit of context of what you're seeing. This is real data from a Scrum team that was given to me and anonymized, of course. And you can see here the different items that were completed, and the colors represent the story point value that was attributed to them. So this is from the cycle time scatter plot in Actionable Agile, and you can see here the legend of the different colors. And just like you said, something I thought was very interesting is that when looking is that here, for example, you have a 0.5 value, like a dot, and it took 54 days to be completed. Then if I look at there, I have a 3, that took 40 days to be completed. And then here I have a story point value of 5 that took 15 days to be completed. So the scale doesn't really seem to be adding up, right? That's really what you were mentioning. It's a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, all those that were 0.5 or 0.1, those
Mhm.
dots should all be along the bottom, right? Because
Yeah.
it should have been done in a very short period of time. And as you look up the scale, the number of days, it's clear that there's a lot of the top three, the 0, the 0.5, and the ones that are up way above 10 days.
Exactly, because here all the dots are plotted based on when they were completed and how old they were completed. So if you put them all with colors, no matter what, you should see zeros at the bottom, 0.5, your ones, your threes. You should have kind of clear color bands, maybe with a few variation for tickets that you didn't know much about and things change. But here there's no real pattern. So that's really proof that should you make any plans based on story point values? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to highlight the different points. So from the same data set, I wanted to show the story point values and the range. So on the whole data set, a 0 in story point value, the range on the cycle time went from 1 to 19 days. It could be anything in between. For an item that had been valued at 0.5 went anywhere from 1 to 54 and so forth. So it's quite interesting to see that it's quite a wide range. So how long is it going to take you to do any of those? Well, that's a bit harder to predict, right?
Yeah,
Using
and
those.
ironically, here with this data, they would have been wrong in their predictions if they went by cycle time, or excuse me, by story points, because a 5-point story ranged from 6 to 28 days. So they didn't expect the 5-pointer to be done in a day or two, right?
No.
But how did the 5-point work get done in between 6 and 28 days? And the 1-point work can take 1 to 72 days. Like, was that a priority change? Was it somebody didn't know how to do something? There are a lot of things that could go on, and you can drill into the data and figure that out. But that to me is an example that I can't say based on the story points how long this will take, because I've got way too wide of a range there. 1 to 72 days. Like if I went to the auto mechanic and dropped off my car and I said, here's a small job, how long will it take you to replace this part? Between 1 and 72 days, we'll let you know as we make progress. I can't go without my car for 72 days. So that's not a good enough estimate. Like they need to be better than that.
No, exactly. And the thing is that, so I looked at the average cycle time. So if I took all of my 0 pointers, what would be the average cycle time for all of the issues? And here are the numbers. So at least something that's good is that the zeros on average take less time than the 5, and it kind of grows crescendo, right? So at least that's something. But still, if you can go anywhere from 1 to 19 and you use an average to forecast, saying, okay, but on average, my zeros take 7.43 days. What do you do when they take 19? Or here, you take 10.19. It's like, oh, I'll use the average then to use, but that can go anywhere from 1 to 72.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when you end up on something that takes 72 days? So it's...
Yeah. And my confidence in, if somebody came to me and said, here's a small feature we need delivered ASAP, how soon can you get it done? I would not feel comfortable looking at my history of story points and saying probably around 20 days, when I know that there have been some that took 72 days. I would want more evidence than that.
Exactly. Because you never know what can happen. Like you said, someone might get sick, priorities change, and so forth. So it's okay when there's a little bit of variation because plans change, but still they're just... yeah, I find it hard to use that data to forecast anything that would make sense, and that's actionable as well for the team to decide, okay, but how do we fix this? Why did this one take so long? And then trying to figure it out. So it's so I thought it was an interesting case using real data. And I had to give a shout out to Julie Starling, one of our customers, because she's the one who used this, exactly what I just showed you, to move away from story points at her company, and shows that, hey, maybe there's things that might be a bit easier done in a different way. So
yeah, and my favorite part about all of this data is that when I saw these metrics for my teams when we first started using actionable agile and switching from story points, I had to prove to the teams that it was valuable.
Mm.
So when I looked at these charts, I was really happy to see that I could drill into the data and find what had been delayed by how long and what kind of work it was, and then I could follow up on that stuff. It made it super easy to really dig into those issues and say, how can we do better? How can we make sure we don't let anything sit on the board for 72 days in the future? Like, let's get our targets down so that we can say with confidence to our customers when they ask us when something can be done, we can have confidence that we can forecast that accordingly.
Exactly. And we're going to jump into that in a second to show more example. But I wanted to show you something. So this is taken from a community post on the Atlassian marketplace. And basically, so that's real examples from teams who now were able to use decimals to highlight story points values. So we saw the 0.5 before. It's like, okay, I can kind of understand the need for that, but it's a little bit hard to see. But basically, some of them are like 1.707, 3.28. And then it comes to the same thing. What does that mean? What does the 28 versus 29 would mean? And then I'm just wondering what's the true value behind it. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to see as well, that because you have the ability to do it, it's good to think about what's the meaning behind it. What's the use case? Why do you need to use those decimals? Because I'm having a hard time finding a use for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the story points are really meant for the team, right? That's not meant to go anywhere outside the team, although people try to use it that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's really for the team to see, to balance their work and see if they have enough, too much, whatever. So if they're working with numbers that make sense to them, that might be okay. But still, we go back to the question of, did it help you get the work done when you thought it should be or could be, or did it not? And then how do you tell your customer when will it be done? Because you can't say, well, that one's a 3.28 story, so it'll probably be done in 3 weeks. Like, those numbers mean nothing to anybody outside the team.
No.
So if you use that as your one and only way of forecasting, evidence shows that you'll be wrong most of the time.
Exactly. And I think that's when story points get lost, is that the original goal for them was for teams to discuss complexity and effort and discuss, oh, this is hard. Oh, I don't know. This might take us a long time. Discuss it with the team and make plans based on that. Not forecast when something will be done based on that. And then it's just, like we said, it's way too subjective. So
yeah.
This doesn't mean anything. And if people use that and they understand this, I would love to hear from it and see how do you use it then? Because to me, it feels very difficult to understand the use case behind that and why do people do that. So, yeah. So instead, I'm thinking, okay, so now that we've understood that what story points are, how they've been used, what people are trying to do with it, and why they shouldn't really do it, let's look at what could people do instead. And there's a lot of things out there that are available for people to use instead of estimations and guesses and so forth. And I would say that would be to use what they've actually done, right? Because looking at what you've done in the past should give enough information to understand what you might be able to do in the future. So for that, in the flow metrics, that's defined in Kanban, but that can be used no matter the methodology you use. Kanban, Scrum, doesn't matter. Like, it's not just a Kanban thing, but it's a really good way to measure your work. And two of those flow metrics are the throughput. And throughput is the rate at which you have completed work in the past. So for example, my daily throughput, how much work I accomplish every day, my weekly one every week, and so forth. So you define which unit of time you're interested in. And then we have cycle time. And cycle time is the total elapsed time it took an item from start to finish. And then what start and finish means, that's for you to define. That doesn't really matter, right? But those are really crucial information that can help you instead of story points. So let's take a deep dive into how to do multiple item forecast. Because that's what people are trying to do, right, with story points. It's like, okay, I have this sprint coming up or something. How much work can I accomplish in that given time period, right? Or how long will it take me to accomplish all those things that we want to achieve, right? And the problem is that you can't really do that with story points. We said like it's not always representative. So instead, what you can use using your throughput, it's what is called Monte Carlo simulations. And those simulations, basically what they will do is provide you a probabilistic forecast. So they will look at how you've done things in the past, run simulations, and then tell you what's the likelihood of achieving what you're trying to do. So I just wanted to go through the different Monte Carlo simulations, how they work, and how your throughput is actually the really key into all of this. So to forecast more than one item, you can use Monte Carlo simulation, and you can use either Monte Carlo when, which will tell you when will you be done with a number of items or a range. Let's say you have 50 items in your backlog, when will you be done with those? And then the other one is how much work can you accomplish by a given date? So let's say I have a deadline on September 1st. How much work can I expect to accomplish by then? And let's see how those work. So some of you might be familiar with this chart. This is the throughput run chart from Actionable Agile. And what it shows you is how many items were completed per day. So what do you think, Caroline? What do you like about this chart and how useful is it?
I like it, and it makes me it automatically takes me into process questions. But when you have the 12 items were completed on this date, the zeros are usually weekends or just days that you didn't complete something. But what this tells me is that the team is in a habit of closing everything probably on the last day of their sprint for the most part. And that's why the 12 ones. And that's, that could be good or bad. It doesn't matter, but it's something that the team could dig into to see, did it really take us 12 days or excuse me, how many days is that one? I can't see it.
Here you don't see how long it took you. That's the thing. Here it's all about the number of items completed per day. Because here it doesn't matter how long it took you to do those, right? Here it's really purely about the cadence at which you've been doing work.
Yeah.
So I think it's truly valuable to first understand how are you releasing work? Like how is work being completed? Because like you said, you can make this chart tell you everything. If you do weekly releases, if you do regular releases, when people were on vacations, when you were closed or stuff like that, it will say everything because everything is taken into account.
Yeah, and it's going to look at the team's definition of done. So if one team is marking things done the day they complete the sprint, is that because they're releasing it that day, or is it because they finished their development, so they mark it done because that's the day they actually completed the work? So teams can then look at, depending on how we're running our workflow, is this a good thing or a bad thing? How does this relate to our team? And if it's a bad thing, what can we do about it? So it gives you a lot of data to work with for sure.
Exactly, because here it's very flexible with what done means to you. You can select that and so forth. But the reason we use this and why it's so important, because here we tell you that there's 12 tickets that were completed on the 14th of April. And basically, in those items, there will be tickets that have a short cycle time, some that are a bit bigger, some, it will take into account all the different types of work that you do every day. So with the caveat that what you've done in the past weeks is roughly similar to what you're going to do in the future, this is a really great way to forecast how much work you're able to do. So,
Margaux, we have a question from Aaron.
Yes.
Do you want to answer that now, or do you want to?
Yes, of course. So would real-time estimates of time be more valued for these metrics? That depends. I think it depends on estimates. Like it's the same thing. What would you say, Caroline?
I would say if you use the data from your team, your project, whatever data you're pulling in, it's going to show you the history, which means you don't need an estimate anymore. You forecast off that history. So you're looking at, you can hopefully narrow it down to similar work, and it might be over a 3-week or 3-month period. But if you can see how long that work took the team, then you can look at similar work and say, well, we got all of this work done in less than 30 days, so we can surely get it done within 30. And then as you get closer and closer, you can give more accurate, higher confidence forecasts at that point. So it's something that you don't just forecast. This is another big difference. You don't just forecast or predict on one day where you would assign a point to the work. You would have your meeting, assign your story points, and then start your sprint. But in flow metrics world, you look at your history, you figure out what you can handle in a time frame, so you pull that work in, and then you watch to see if you're staying on track and getting the work done in time. And that's typically something a scrum master would do, or a leader. And you would be able to, with confidence, know that this kind of work can get done in 30 days or less. So you plan for that. And then there's no estimating per se, like we used to do.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Mm. Let us know, Aaron, if that makes sense. But that's the thing, is that you can always look back to what you've actually done and see what was good, not so good, and understand if there's anything you can improve. Then you can improve upon that, having action on what's in progress. And we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves there. We're going to show you more details a bit later. But basically, that's the whole goal, is looking at what you've actually done to forecast what you will do in the future, and stop using guesses and gut feelings, but using data. The data is there, so just let's use it to do that. And we have another questions. How do these metrics impact the way teams approach continuous improvement and retros? Exactly that. Is that by continuing looking back at what you've done, comparing with what's in progress today, then you will be able to see when things are getting out of lines or things are changing. Maybe there's a new trend going on. And then when you do a retrospective, for example, you can look back into what happened in the last sprint and the sprint before. What was good, what was not so good. It's all about the discussion and figure out if there's anything that could have been improved or not.
And this is one of my favorite things, because day one, I think, of when we first installed Actionable Agile, we saw a lot of opportunity for data cleanup. We weren't managing the data the way that we should have been, or we were moving things to the backlog, but not really changing the status. So it looked like things were in progress when they really weren't. So that would have totally ruined our cycle time if we were using those metrics at that point. So we first cleaned up a lot of our data, understood how to better manage the board and the workflow. But retro is already my favorite ceremony anyway. But what was cool is with these flow metrics, you can watch it, you can manage the work, you can dig into questions on a daily basis, like in stand-up. But you then also can look at retro and say, okay, here's what we've done over the last 1, 2, or 3 sprints, or 1, 2, or 3 months. Depending, it doesn't matter if you're using Kanban or Scrum; it works for both. But you can look at the history and you can talk about how things were handled and what you might want to do differently next time to reduce the cycle time or whatever. But it gives you great data to talk about in retro, because again, you're not operating on just feeling or emotion. It's the numbers. They don't lie.
I just went ahead in the presentation just to show you the best tool you can have in your retros, and that's looking at the edge of your work. Because here, for example, there's the aging work in progress chart in Actionable Agile, and you see all the different pieces of work currently in progress, how old they are, and where in your workflow as well. And then the colors kind of show you how items move through your workflow in the past. So the dark green would be how 50% of your work exited each column, the green, 70, the yellow, 85, and the red, the rest. So what it's really telling you is that when you're in your first active stage here, for example, and you have an item that's already in the red, that means that it's already older than 95% of everything else that has gone through before. So that may be something to bring up with your team. It's like in your stand-up, it's like, what's happening with this one? And then, oh, it's too big. Okay, but what should we do with it? Let's move it back to the backlog, breaking down into small pieces of work. Or no, maybe it's not relevant anymore. Let's finish, complete it, put a resolution or something. And it's all about making decisions on the data using this. And with the aging replay, you can go back to any day in your data set, so the start of your sprint, for example, and see how things move through your workflow during that sprint and see if everything improved. So maybe that was the start of your sprint with a lot of things in the red, not so great. And then as the sprint progressed, everything is kind of smoothed down and everything's fine, right? So that's how looking at the edge of your work can be so crucial into so many of those ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
I hope we answered your question, Veronica. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit. We'll come back to this because there's a few more things we can say. But I wanted to go back on Monte Carlo simulation. So here at the bottom, you will see that's the throughput. That's exactly the same thing I just showed you before, because as it showed you what you've done in the past, you can use that to run simulations. And here, for example, we're on the Monte Carlo when. So I would like to know, when will I be done with 50 items? So, and you could put a range as well. That works exactly the same way. So if I start work on the 25th, that was, let's say today, and then I have 50 items, how long will it take me to complete those? And looking at how you've completed work in the past, you can apply filter to exclude what's not necessary and so forth. But let's assume everything's good. You can then get a forecast with different probabilities. And then it's all about, okay, based on the data we have now, here's the forecast. And then you have different probabilities and then in confidence levels. And that's for you to decide how certain do you have to be with your forecast to give it to your manager, stakeholders, or whoever is asking, really. So here, for example, you have an 85% chance of being done by September 20th or before, and or after, actually. Yeah. So you have all of that information here. And the beauty of that is that you decide what value you want to give your manager, stakeholder. And every day that you complete work, for example, your throughput changes. Either it's better, the worse, or same, and that will impact your forecast. So you always get an updated forecast based on what you're actually doing, not what you think you're going to do. And that makes a whole difference because this is way more trustworthy, as long as the data is correct, of course. But that's a big thing that makes a big difference. Making plans based on this and not story points will give much better results in the end. Does the Monte Carlo simulation consider the number of stories already in progress that may need to finish first before these new 50 stories start? So the thing is that right now, we look at stories. It's 50 stories. We don't know the status of those, right? But I would consider that you need to take into account what's already in progress. So let's say you have 50 in your backlog and 30 in progress. I would put 30 in there because it's taken into account into your forecast. Do you agree, Carolyn? Is that how you would do it?
Yep.
Or,
Yeah, you can drive really much anything as far as boundaries go. There's no steadfast rule that you can only look at these number of items or this number of days. You get to pick and choose where you want to start measuring from.
You can put a range if you don't really know, because the thing that here we're telling you 50 items, but we have no idea what those 50 items in your backlog are. If it's a lot of epics, is it a lot of things? It's just 50 items that should be roughly similar to what you've done in the past. So it's not as granular as that. So yeah, you're welcome, Russell. All right, let's continue. So here's just a quick summary on the forecast for single items. And that's when we're going to jump into what Karen was saying before with service level expectation and knowing how to define those. So to forecast multiple items, we look at Monte Carlo simulations. If you want to forecast one item, then you can just look at your cycle time, right? Because then you can see how the dot is plotted and what's your completion rate. So let's take a deeper dive into that. So on this chart, like I said before, you see all the dot plotted based on when they were completed and how old they were. No story points, it's all about cycle time here. And that's where a lot of conversation can be driven from, because the first question is, how long does it actually take you to do work? And most teams might take you, if they do 2 weeks sprint, well, it takes me 14 days or less to do work, a sprint. But is that really the case? Can you always start and finish all your work you have in one sprint? That's a big conversation. And as you know, that rarely happens. It can, but it rarely happens. And here, at least you can really see how long does it take you. So you have different percentile lines that will calculate, okay, all of my dots are under this or less. So here, for example, I have 85% of all of my dots that are 16 or less. So it's telling me that 85% of all the work I've done before was done in 16 days or less. So if you work in 2 week sprint, is that good? Is that bad? Maybe it's not that great, but it's not too bad either. But
and it's going to differ. It's going to differ by team too. So, some work, depending on the kind of team they are, some work can be done very quickly all the time. Another team might have other work that always takes 2, maybe 3 sprints to complete. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can always look at the data and ask yourself, is there an opportunity to improve from where we are right now? And in some cases, the answer may be no, just because of the nature of the work. In other cases, the answer might be, heck yeah, we have a lot of room for improvement. We should do things a little bit differently. And then you can take steps based on that data to make improvements. So again, even your process improvement steps aren't based on a gut feeling. They're an experiment based on data, which to me, in our world, makes a lot more sense.
Exactly, because here, if 85% of your work was done in 16 days or less, what did this one take 43? In the app, you could click and that you would see the highlight of how long it actually take you in each workflow stage and so forth, and drive conversation from that. So it's really all about the conversation. And here it's finished, right? That's historical data as well, but it carries some really important information, because here we can clearly see that everything was quite stable, and then there was a big batch of items that were much older. So if you had like a year worth of data and you can see that fluctuation, that help you predict that maybe that might happen again. So it's really valuable to look at the cycle time of your work as well. How long did it actually take? And then do you want to include the backlog time in it or not? That's for you to decide, but it's very flexible.
And if you compare this to say to your customers, well, you know what, based on our history, we have been able to get, 85% of the time our work is done in 16 days or less. So I'm really confident that we'll have your work done in, that time or less. And, maybe it's going to be 20, but still, what is it? Where's the 90?
95 is at 23.
So even if you have to wait until you're 95% confident and say, we know we'll get it done in less than 23 days. That's better than our previous example where we were looking at a range between 1 and 72 days. So if I could tell a customer that I have high confidence that we can get your work done in 23 days or less, that's going to be much more accurate, and they're going to be much happier than saying, I don't know, it could take somewhere between 1 and 72 days. I can't really say for sure.
Exactly. But here, at least you can trust the forecast. And then when it happens, then you can say, okay, that happened. The chance of it being true, there's just 5% risk, right? So it's really how much risk are you willing to take? And I think that's much more valuable conversation than spending time on estimating things instead of doing the real work.
Yeah. Do I have a minute to give you a quick example?
Yeah, of course.
So we had a team we were new to Actionable Agile. We were just getting started. One of the Scrum Masters was really excited about it. They had gotten a new chunk of work that they were taking on from another part of the business, stuff they hadn't really worked on before, but it had you needed the same skill set as this team had. So they knew that they were dealing with a little bit more complexity because it was unknown to them. They knew what they'd been able to complete in the past and how long things had taken based on their cycle time. Even though they were only using story points at that time, I worked with them to look at, what have you done in the past and what's your confidence level that, you can get this work done in a certain amount of time. Then let's look at the metrics in Actionable Agile for that same historical work. And even though the work is slightly different, the skill set is pretty much the same. So you have a little bit of a learning curve, but probably not as bad as learning a new technology. So with that abstract information, we then also paired that with the data to say, if I look back at your last 6 months, you guys were able to get everything done in this amount of time. So they were given this new chunk of work and they were asked, can you get this done in 8 weeks or less? And they're like, heck, we have no idea. So when we brought Actionable Agile into it and we've had that conversation, they were very confident that they would be able to get it done in 8 weeks or less because of what these metrics showed them. And so then I showed the Scrum Master how to watch it every day, keep an eye on the WIP age, keep an eye on making sure things don't get too old. If you get stuck, don't let it sit before you get help. And it really helped improve their process. But overall, their confidence grew every week as they revisited that metric in their charts. And they were able to get it all done and deployed within 6 weeks. That never would have happened in the past because they had no way to, if they had committed to the 8 weeks, it would have been a crapshoot. They would have had no idea if they were going to make it or not. And then they're a little bit panicked and stressed. And this way they were a lot more confident, a lot less stressed. And they really liked having information to back up what they were thinking. So for them, it was a big win.
Yeah, but that's really the case. That's usually what happens when you use data. It makes a whole difference. And a team that's less stressed will do less mistakes, will rush less, there will be less issues coming out of it as well. So usually that's how you can improve. First, use those metrics to see what's going on with your work. Identify what's good, what's not so good, and could be improved. Make the improvement. And as you go, things will improve, just like you said. And that's super valuable because eventually, because you can always run a forecast. Then will it be accurate or not? That depends on the data. But as you go and you improve the way you do your work, you will become more predictable. And if you're more predictable, your forecast will be way more accurate. And hopefully you can work out to a forecast that you like to, that aim with your goals. So a quick recap on what are the advantages of probabilistic forecasting compared to using story point estimate is that, first of all, it's much faster than spending time estimating this, that, how long it's going to take. You use your real data and not estimate. So already that's what really happened. You can't lie. And then it's always up to date, because if you use a tool like Actionable Agile, the data is already there. So you don't need to keep going and adding and checking with someone that everything is already up to date. So that's a good improvement.
Yeah, and if you're tracking stuff in spreadsheets right now to help your teams, stay in track or improve and make sure you don't exceed whatever threshold you've set for yourself, this will save you so much time.
Exactly. And the thing is that if you will get a forecast. If you don't like the forecast, it's not the end of the world. There's stuff you can do to help you improve this. And that's when the chart I showed you, and we're going to go back in quickly again, it's managing what's in progress. That's the only thing you can have an impact on, right? Because what you've done yesterday, it's finished. You can't do anything about that. But if you manage the edge of your work and how much work you have in progress, that's the two next flow metrics, by the way. WIP age and work in progress, you have everything in your hands to have better control of what's happening and improve what's not going super right. So here, that's the edging work in progress chart. Bit of a mouthful, but it's a really good chart, because really, if you pay attention to this, if you're not happy with your forecast because things take too long, well, you have to make sure things go faster through your workflow if you can. You can't always, because the work is the work. But if you can manage it better, the cycle time will be reduced. You will have less outliers. If you have less outliers, you're more predictable. It seems simple like this. It might not happen, super fast, but it's doable, and it really happens. Have you
Yeah, this is
experienced
the first place I went when we first loaded it. We looked at all the stuff at the top of the chart, like in the red. What happened with it? Is it, like this stuff is still in progress. So what can we do about it? Why is it in progress? This is where we found a lot of stuff that should have been changed to the status of backlog, but didn't. It physically got moved there. So it was out of sight, out of mind. And they totally didn't realize that all this other work was sitting and we're waiting for something to happen.
And then it is still valuable 6 months later when you discover that 600 something days old item.
Yep.
Not. So it's really good to do cleanup to start with, and then managing it. And that's really a key chart that could be used every day and should be used every day to help with all of that. So to summarize it all, let's stop using story points to forecast. I'm not saying that you should stop using story point overall, because it's a great conversation to have with your team about effort and complexity, but that does not equal to time. Instead, use Monte Carlo simulations to get updated forecasts with different outcomes and probabilities, so you can decide what to do, and it's always up to date. Manage your WIP so that you can actively be in control over what's happening, so you don't get surprised when something takes way longer and so forth. And use flow metrics to be aware of what's going on. So that really will have such an impact on how you do your work, reducing stress and having better visualization, conversation with your team. That's really the key with flow metrics.
The way that I learned about Actionable Agile was we were working with consultants that we brought in at my last employer to help us with our Agile organization and transition. And every time the leader said, how are we going to measure success of this engagement? Their answer was, you need to look into flow metrics. Check out Actionable Agile. I was like, what's that? So I love metrics. So I jumped in and looked at it. And by downloading a trial of that, playing with it for 30 days with our own data, I was able to convince our leadership that we needed this tool to help us measure because they liked what they saw. It wasn't like we were reporting, one team compared to another. That was not the case, but we were able to show that if we knew what the data was like on these teams and we knew what their timelines were, their cycle time, we knew that we could work to improve that. And the data showed them that. So that was how we got our green light to go forward, because it mattered. Like, I like to call it metrics that matter.
Yeah, but that's the thing, because something that's good to remember is that a tool like Actionable Agile, it does not look at the worker, it looks at the work, because it's workflow, right? It's about the work. It's never about the people behind it. So it's really about improving how the work flows. So people don't feel too stressed about, oh my God, I can't be on vacation because everything's going to explode, or all of that. It's really about that. And it's focusing time on what matters as well. I think that's a good way to look at it. So we are now out of time, but do you have any last words, Caroline, that you would like to share?
No, just I hope that people give this good consideration, because story points was what we had when we first started. A lot of us when we started our Agile journey. But the cool part is there's always opportunities for the industry to improve, just like we're trying to help teams improve. So the Actionable Agile metrics flow metrics has been my favorite thing about my Agile journey so far. Like, I was already a metrics geek before I discovered it, but it really helped me help the teams make real improvements that I didn't have the knowledge or proof of things that they could do differently before. So I see it as a huge benefit all around.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So just so you know, everyone, so this webinar will be uploaded to YouTube, and I will make sure to send you all an email with the presentation in case you would like to go back, see definitions, and so forth. If anyone would need some consulting help or has questions, you can, of course, reach out to the lovely Caroline. If you would like to start a trial or have more questions, you can also reach out to us directly. So we will send you an email with lovely follow-up with all of that. So thank you very much, everyone, and I see you in the next webinar.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.